أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the second in this series, Witnesses to Humanity. For the Muharram 1446 commemoration, we pay tribute to a number of individuals in the history of humanity who have stood tall in the face of adversity, who have given their lives for the principles of truth, justice, and the better of mankind. Indeed, the tragedy of Karbala that we commemorate during these days of Muharram is a cornerstone of the reflections that we will have. And we will reflect on the ultimate sacrifices made by these heroes of humanity, including Imam Hussein, the grandson of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon them both. So as we embark on this journey, Witnesses for Humanity, we're here to learn and shift our perspective, as I said yesterday, on the concept of becoming witnesses and not just being witnesses. That a witness must be an active and a powerful verb, and to witness is to actively stand for the truth and justice, and to engage in the relentless pursuit of a better world. This is our call, and this is what has been taught by these amazing personalities, the figures that we honor in this series. Today, we will listen to Dr. Aslam Abdullah. Welcome, Dr. Aslam. And we'll be looking at a Chinese poet and a statesman, Yuan, and also Rabbi Akiva, a physician, and Rabbi Akiva, a great personality and a sage in the history of Judaism. So over to you, Dr. Aslam.
Thank you very much. Auzubillahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Yesterday we were in the Middle East as well as in Greece, trying to understand how the divine guidance and the divine revelation inspired people and individuals to stand for the truth and justice. Today, let's go to China. And let's go to China in year 340 of Common Era. That is before the birth of the Christ. With reference to one of the annual festival that all over the world we dedicate to, especially Chinese people, which is called the Dragon Boat Festival. It's in memory of that individual that we are going to talk about, that is Ku Yuan, who was born in 340 BC and who died in 278 BC. He was a Chinese poet, aristocrat in the state of Chu at a time when the Chinese states were warring against each other. He was a great patriot, and he was the one who were at pain seeing all that was happening in the whole of China in terms of these wars and these fiefdoms. And he expressed his lamentation in classical poetry and verses through poems that became the foundation of the Chinese literature, and then it became the essence of the struggles of that particular time. Not much is known about his life because the first time we hear about his life is 174 years after his demise, when many of his disciples started writing about about him, and then certainly much of what we hear comes from those sources. What is survived are the poems, the long poems, and certainly we will talk about those poems in a while. Uh, uh, the only a surviving source of information on his life is the biography of another person, which is by Sima Qian, and records of the grand historian. And the biography is more about Sima's own identification with Ku. But he wrote that he was a member of the Chinese court and royal clan, and then he served as an official under King Hui of Chu dynasty. It is reported that during the early days of King Hu's reign, Ku Yuan was serving as the state of Chu as its minister. But King Hua exiled him to the region north of Han River because corrupt ministers slandered him and influenced the king. Eventually, he was reinstated and then sent on a diplomatic mission to the states of Kui. But he tried to reassure the relationship between Chu and many other things. During his wandering and during his exile, he wrote a lot of poetry. And certainly that poetry became the foundation of the Chinese literature. He spent much of his time collecting legends, rearranging folk odes while traveling the countryside. He wrote some of the greatest poetries in Chinese literature, and we will refer to at least one of the poetry that basically depicts his struggle and his inner thought uh, that led to his demise and his death. Uh, it is said that he committed suicide by drowning himself in the river, which is in Hunan province, while holding a rock. And some people call it uh, a suicide uh, out of weakness. But in his own words, according to many of those who wrote his biography, that he was ultimately protecting his innocence and life's principles rather than compromising with those principles, rather than yielding to the powers of the elites. He was one of the poems that he wrote is called what we call, I think, Li Sao, which is translated as encountering sorrow in English. It has nearly 2,500 words, and it is the longest piece of lyric poetry in ancient China. Now, I just looked at this poem and found very interesting passages. It begins with these uh, 8 lines. A prince am I of ancestry renowned, illustrious, name my royal sire has found. When Cyrus did in his spring its light display, a child was born, and tiger marked the day when first upon my face my lord's eyes glanced for me auspicious names. He straight advanced, denoting that in me heaven's marks divine should with the virtue of the earth combine. This is how he introduces himself, and this is how basically he begins this. Then he laments about what witnessed, in which he says, insatiable in lust and greediness, the factions strove and tired not of excess, themselves condoning, others they would decry, and steep their hearts in envious jealousy. That is about the other thing. And then he talks about the ruling elites. I marvel at the folly of the king, so heedless of his people's suffering. They envied me, my moth-like eyebrows fine, and so my name his damsels did malign. Truly to craft alone their praise they paid. The square in measuring they disobeyed. The use of common rules they held debased, while confidence their crooked lines they traced. And then he finally says, in sadness plunged and sunk in deepest gloom, alone I drove on my dreary doom. In exile rather would I meet my end than to the baseness of their way descent. Remote, the eagle spurns the common range, nor deigns since time began its way to change. The circle fits not with a square design, their different ways could not be merged with mine, yet still my heart I checked and curbed my pride. Their blame endured, and their reproach beside. To die for righteousness alone I sought, for this was what the ancient sages taught. Now, this one is one of the longest Chinese piece of literature and poetry, and certainly it is a marvel of ideas. And finally, he concludes that poem with saying, and the word is dark and envious of my grace. They veil my virtue and the evil praise. Thy chamber dark lies in recess deep, sagacious prince, rises thou not from sleep. My zeal unknown, the prince would not descry. How could I bear this harsh enmity? And certainly this is reflected in the in his note to the suicide, and that he is saving his innocence rather than compromising the principles that he stood for. And so he certainly would be remembered as the most powerful and the first great political allegorical uh, Chinese poet, and who is lamenting uh, as a minister unjust uh, practices of his time and challenging them and then expressing them in a popular language that could inspire people. And certainly, probably in many of the revolutions that took place in China, we find that kind of uh, those ideas echoing. So that was the great poet, a philosopher, a person who offered his life for those principles that he stood for. So now let's move to the other individuals. Certainly, we thought about many others in this. But let's talk about the one who, who is known as Akiva bin Joseph. Akiva bin Joseph is a Jewish scholar. He was born in 50 Christian era, and he died in 135, I think, of Christian area, nearly 85 years of age. And he was a leading Jewish scholar, a rabbi, and a sage. In fact, he is known in the first century as the sage of the sages. He's the one who is a leading contributor to Mishnah and Midrash, two of the very important books of the Jewish people. And he was executed by the Romans in the aftermath of a revolt in which he was accused and he was brought. He was the one who descended from converts to Judaism. And then what we also find is Akiva attended the academy of his native town, Lod, which is in part of that area, and he was a physician also, and he was he's reported to have a rabbinic relationship with many other great rabbis of their time, and he was convinced of the necessity of a central authority for Judaism. This is something very interesting. He became a devoted adherent and friend of many other rabbis, including Rabbi Gamaliel, who aimed at constituting the patriarch, the true spiritual chief of the Jews. However, Akiva was just as firmly convinced that the power of the patriarch must be limited both by the written and the oral law, the interpretation of which lay in the hands of the learned, and he was accordingly brave enough to act in ritual matters and rabbinical matters in his own house, and contrary to the decisions of many of the known rabbis of that particular time. He was in Rome in 95 and 96 of Christian era, and he was also traveling. He visited other places that had important Jewish community. He also took part in what is called Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 to 136 CE, but his role here is not very historically determined. And the only established fact concerning his connection with this war is that he regarded the war as the war that would bring the promised Messiah. This is the only evidence of his participation, and for that he was killed. His death occurred, after several years of imprisonment, and which places it about 132 before the suppression of the Bar Kokhba in revolution. The religious interdicts of the Jewish rabbis, uh, were at that particular time neutral. They did not stand for his rights, and they did not speak for him. And he was killed in a very cruel manner, where his skin was flayed with iron combs. And you can imagine that kind of torture that basically the Romans uh, inflicted upon him. He is usually rendered as some redacted form of three separate versions of the circumstances, that is, his death. Each version shares the same basic plot points, where he defies the Roman prohibition on teaching of Torah, and he also uh, uh, questioned many of the rabbinical traditions, and he defied them in his own practice. And one of the common version of his death is that the government ordered him to stop teaching Torah, and he refused. And as a result, he was put on iron comb and then killed. He that he tried to give a unified version to Judaism, bringing them together with the idea around monotheism and with the idea of uh, um, focusing on values of justice and truth. And ultimately, he had to suffer for teaching that, as the Romans were, of course, uh, a very strongly hierarchical community and society. And then they basically uh, fought against him and then killed him ultimately. I hand it over to you, Doctor.
Thank you, Dr. Aslam, for elucidating Rabbi Akiva and Kuwan. The striking similarities that each of them faced the injustice and still stood against the oppressive powers in their times. These are remarkable individuals. Like you said, be it in China, be it in Middle East, these values are universal. These values are within each culture, within each faith, and hailing from different cultural and historical contexts. Obviously, as you elucidated, that they demonstrated an extraordinary commitment to their principles. As you were speaking, I was trying to analyze, what were those commonalities, and I looked at number one was injustice. The second was speaking truth to power. Number three, their sense of sacrifice and the legacy that they have left. For example, Rabbi Akiva lived under Roman occupation in Judea, where there was heavy restriction and persecution of the Jewish people, which was a norm. And despite this, he continued to teach and practice his faith, which obviously led to the severe punishment and ultimately his death. Kuan, same thing from the poetry, that he also experienced political corruption and intrigue in his home state of Chu, which again eventually led him into exile, despite his unwavering loyalty and patriotism. So when you compare those two, you can see the similarities with Imam Hussein, that he too faced the oppressive rule of the Umayyads, and it was marked by widespread injustice and corruption. So the similarities, and obviously his martyrdom at Karbala epitomizes the extreme injustice that he and his followers endured. Same thing, speaking against power. When you look at Rabbi Akiva, like you said, he supported the Bar Kokhba revolt against the Roman rule. And he viewed it, as a movement and a stand against oppressive power. And even under the death of threat, he defied the Roman ban in teaching Judaism. Kuwan, same thing, uses poetry to criticize the political corruption and his eventual, suicide by drowning, as it is said by some, was a poignant act of protest against the rulers of his state. When you look at Karbala, same thing. Imam Hussein refused to pledge allegiance to Yazid, challenging the legitimacy, of his rule. And again, here he led a small group to stand against Yazid's much larger army, symbolizing resistance and oppression. Sacrifice, we can see the sacrifices in the lives of each. The execution of Rabbi Akiva, making the ultimate sacrifice, Kuwan's suicide, was a statement, a profound personal sacrifice in the act of despair and protest. He tried to awaken his countrymen to the state, of their beloved country or the state. Imam Hussein's sacrifice, needless to say, at Karbala was intended for the same thing, where he and his followers gave their lives, and is remembered as one of the most poignant examples of selflessness and devotion to a just cause in the history of humanity. Finally, the legacy that they have left, his contribution, Rabbi Akiva's contribution to Jewish law, has had a lasting impact on Judaism, and his martyrdom remains a powerful testament to his faith and dedication, which has inspired future generations. Kuwan's literary works, especially the Li Sao, continue to be foundational in Chinese literature, and his legacy is celebrated, as you mentioned, annually during the Dragon Boat Festival, which honors his loyalty and his patriotism. Similarly, Imam Hussein's stand and what we are doing during these 10 days are central to symbolizing that legacy of a fight against tyranny and injustice. So these are similarities as we will continue in the days to come, that their sacrifices, their legacies continue to inspire and shape their respective cultures and communities to this day. Our task here is to share all these experiences so that they don't remain within respective cultures and communities, but they are shared universally, because these struggles by these great men and women are truly universal, and they must be acknowledged, they must be commemorated by all of us as to what they have done. So in the end, we pray that let us imbibe these series and these presentations, perhaps with a renewed commitment to stand firm in our convictions. And as I said at the outset, to be active witnesses, witness as a verb, witness not as a noun to humanity. And let us remember that to witness is to act, to speak out, and to strive tirelessly for a world where injustice prevails. May these 9 days that we have inspire us to embrace our roles as witnesses to humanity, inshallah, and to carry forward the torch of truth and justice as it has been demonstrated so far, and in particular in the memory of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.